Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we are going to be installing a heated steering wheel in my 2017 Chevy Colorado. Let's dig into this and see what's involved. Before you go and buy all the parts you need for this, you need to make sure your vehicle is compatible. I will go into depth on how exactly to check for that. But once you do know your vehicle is compatible, you're going to need a new steering wheel with a heated function, and then also a new Clockspring that allows for the wiring to come through for the heated function. So these are two parts from a GMC Denali, and this is a heated steering wheel. As you can see, this wheel has the heated function on the steering wheel. This is the Clockspring from a GMC Denali. It will hook up exactly the same with the added function of having the harness for the heated steering wheel. To do this, there's some steps involved, but it shouldn't take all that long. In the owner's manual, it has a fuse location for a heated steering wheel in the passenger side fuse block. So if you go into your passenger side fuse block and open up the panel, you may find that there's a fuse already available for a heated steering wheel, even if your vehicle is not equipped with one. Another thing you need to check is if your vehicle actually has the wiring behind the steering wheel. To do that, you need to go underneath the steering wheel near the tilt function and look up through the hole, and if you see a connector in there with nothing connected to it, that's likely the heated steering wheel connection. First off, before doing anything, you need to remove the negative battery cable on your vehicle and then let your vehicle sit for like 30 minutes to let the electrical system discharge. Once you've discharged the electrical system, you can start working on the steering wheel. There are two small holes on either side of the wheel. You need to use a 3mm Allen wrench to insert into these holes and push on a clip that is internal to the steering wheel that releases the posts on the airbag. This technique requires a little bit of finesse and is a little tricky, but it's not overall that hard. Just use the Allen wrench, insert it into the hole, and you'll feel some resistance. You need to push, and then one side will pop up, then you need to do the other side, feel the resistance, push, and the airbag will pop up and release itself from the wheel. You can now gently lower the airbag out away from the steering wheel. There's two connectors on the back side of the airbag, a yellow and a blue connector that are held in with orange toggles. You need to use a small flat-bladed screwdriver to lift the orange toggles, and then you can use that same screwdriver to lift away the connector from the airbag. So very gently lift the orange toggles away from the connector. Then use that same flat-bladed screwdriver and pry the connector off of the airbag. Make sure you're holding the airbag as you release the connectors. Just set your airbag off to the side, facing up, so if it does decide to spontaneously explode, it just explodes up into the air, not actually launching the whole thing somewhere. Next, remove the main wire connector from the steering wheel. It's a simple quick connect. Next, use a T50 Torx socket to remove the bolt that holds the steering wheel to the steering column. Note, thread locker is applied to this bolt. We'll need to add some later. You can now gently pull the steering wheel from the column, but do not yank it from the column or you will rip the wires out of the clock spring. Simple, gentle pressure, and then fish the wires out of the back of the steering wheel. Next, we need to remove the shrouds on the top and the bottom of the steering column. The top is simply held down with clips. Using a trim removal pry bar, you can push up all the clips on the top shroud and work your way around the seam and work that piece up and away, and then you need to fish it over the top of the windshield wiper control stalk. It is not particularly difficult, but the wiper control stalk poses a little bit of a problem sometimes, but just go slow and make sure you don't break any of the connectors, otherwise this piece won't sit back down correctly. Rotating the shroud 90 degrees counterclockwise seems to help release it from its area. And here you can see all of the clips that are holding it down to the bottom shroud. Next, we will remove the shroud from the bottom. There are 3 7mm screws on this shroud, one on the very bottom and then 2 on either side of the clock spring. Use a 7mm socket to loosen these and remove them to free this shroud from the steering column. The bottom shroud does not need to be 100% removed, but these 3 screws are necessary to be loosened in order to replace the clock spring, like I'll show you in the next part. But you can just simply lower the shroud over the tilt mechanism and set it aside for extra room to work. Next, we will remove 4 Phillips screws that are holding the clock spring to the steering column. Simply use a regular Phillips screwdriver and loosen these screws and set them aside for now. After you loosen those screws, you will remove the 2 connectors on the top of the clock spring. The first one is a quick connect, and the second one, the yellow one, has an orange locking tab that needs to be removed first before you can depress the tab and pull the connector from the socket. At this point, the clock spring is loose and can be lifted from the steering column very easily. This is the old clock spring coil pack on the left. You can see it only has the 2 connectors for the steering wheel. This is the new Denali coil pack that has the heated function. So you can see this one has a connector on the bottom here. This is what's going to go to the heated function on the wheel. Then it also has those 2 connectors. Then it also has this back connector here that goes to the vehicle harness that we pointed out earlier. This is for the heated function as well. Basically the same thing, just with 1 extra wire set. We can now lower the new clock spring onto the steering column and line up the 2 pegs on the bottom left and top right. Then use our 4 screws and simply tighten them into place. These do not require to be torqued down like crazy. They are just small bolts and going into plastic, so just nice and snug. Next, we will attach the connectors on the back side of the clock spring. First, the main harness connector slides right in, and then the airbag connector that's orange. First, insert the yellow part, make sure it clicks, then take the orange locking tab and insert it all the way in and lock that connector in place. Next, take the 2-wire connector on the back of the clock spring and install it into that blank connector behind the steering column. You can now reinstall the lower shroud, first lining up the 3 holes that are on the steering column for the 7mm bolts. You also want to make sure to line up the notch on the shroud with the turn signal stalk and the wiper stalk. Then take your 7mm screws and insert them into the 2 sides and the one on the bottom. The shroud on top is a little more difficult to reinstall. First, you have to install it over the wiper stalk and then fish it around back into the spot on top of the turn signal stalk as well. Then lower it onto the lower shroud, lining up all of the clicking tabs to make sure that it holds into place. But once you do get them in place, it simply clicks right down on top of the lower shroud, going around, making sure it's nice and tight around the seam. This is what it will look like once you are successful. The 3 wires hanging out of the clock spring, the shrouds all tighted up nice and tight along the seams, the stalks coming out exactly where they're supposed to, the ignition being perfectly centered in its hole. Now we're ready to reinstall the new wheel, taking the wires and passing them through the back of the wheel. The 2-wire for the heated function goes through the bottom hole, and then the other 2 wires go through the top hole. Then carefully line up the splines on the steering wheel column and the steering wheel itself and lower the steering wheel into place. Your clock spring should be equipped with an orange pull tab that is used for shipping purposes. You can now remove that from the clock spring. It simply pulls out of place. It just keeps the clock spring from spinning during transport. Now we can reconnect the main harness for the steering wheel to the clock spring. It's a simple quick connect that goes right into place with a click. Then we can connect the two other wires that are for the heated function. Route them as I show in the video around that post on the bottom left so that these wires don't interfere with the airbag later on. Now is a good time to remove the plastic wrap because we're going to function test it in the next part of the video. For this next part, I reattached the battery cable so that I had power on the vehicle so we could test the function of the heated steering wheel. Here it is lighting up, and here it is showing that it actually heats up when it's turned on. Before proceeding, disconnect your battery cable and wait 30 minutes for it to decharge. I went ahead and added some fresh removable blue thread locker to the bolt for the steering wheel for some fresh grab. Then using your T50 Torx socket, thread the bolt back into place and tighten down the steering wheel. I couldn't find an exact torque specification for the steering wheel, but I did some research and saw that 30 to 35 foot-pounds is sufficient. The next step is reinstalling the airbag into the steering wheel. You want to line up the posts into the holes, but first you need to reattach the connectors. They go in just like they came out. Simply plug them into the color coordinated spot, yellow to yellow, blue to blue, and then depress the orange locking tab on top of each connector to make sure that they stay in place. Then line up the two posts to the two holes. Then push with gentle pressure. It should lock into place with a very satisfying click. I'm very excited to use the heated steering wheel. This modification has been on my bucket list for a long time, ever since I traded my 2014 Sierra with a heated steering wheel. Don't forget to reattach your negative battery cable and tighten it to the post using a 10mm socket. And that's all there is. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Love it if you subscribed. Stay tuned. Later.